Hello everyone, today we talk about a topic that we're just discussing yesterday in the question and answer video in a completely random fashion as a proof that on Schwerpunkt we routinely discuss certain topics that I get continuously asked about, either because they are objectively complex, as we will see also today, because there are the sort of, 1 hour and a half explanations of questions that you pose, but then there is the much broader historiographical substance that we can browse over the years, and that's actually where you should do your homework, right? And I make this videos for this very purpose, or because by the way, because there is some sort of ideological resistance to certain ideas. I will not enter in the depths of that. I made so many videos in the past, also much more, bloody to an extent, much more violent, that in fact are there, and that I don't know really how YouTube suggests my content, but I have a copious amount of playlists that make it relatively easy to find the stuff. This is not a reference to anyone in particular, nor to yesterday's questions author, to anyone commenting on my channel every time I make these videos, but we'll, let's say in general and personally and impersonally, here's this knows to some extent what I'm talking to. I'm telepathic enough to achieve that. But no, seriously, I mean, being a historian to a great degree is being a psychologist at the end of the day. Today we talk, finally, about late medieval state building and the in fact, national monarchic concept that was developed over time in the historiographical narrative called to explain these topics. We will be splitting here to show actually the paradox of historiography, how different ideologies during the centuries basically always are rooted in something older and more universal, but how, depending on the various political twists, adapt to different circumstances. And at the center of this, there is, of course, the fatidic 19th century that, as you know, it's not just the age of nationalism, of the nation-state, in particular, the resurgence of this, mythology of the past, romanticism, that very often gets misunderstood. People have very sort of polarized, I detest the term, frankly, but it's they always fall into Gnostic heresies. They think it's either in one way or the opposite of it. Like there's not a middle ground that you have actually to be able to keep together, like to criticize, to shape for your own further refinement. And so that this is possibly from a certain angle the simplest reason why it's so easy to get misunderstood in every possible way whatsoever when making this video. The 19th century, as I was saying, is also the age of medievalistics. Like medievalistics wasn't really born in the 19th century; it was born in the century before at large, and there were already great historians researching medieval history. But in the 19th century, we start getting some philological standards, certain national and international researches, cooperations across Europe that really cement more or less the same history, and literally at some point like the same volumes, the collection of sources mostly, but also other historiographical criticism that we use today, as we will see in this video. This is very sort of common knowledge, right? And so it's obvious that this period characterized by the emergence of national identities, so the formation of a fully developed concept of absolute state sovereignty, because that's what it, especially in the civil law, but this by osmosis actually get common law countries and or some hybrid that also exist adopted in the same way, because at the end of the day, the power of the state regarding the mechanism is pretty much the same. Actually, sometimes it's even stronger in common law countries than the civil ones. And this is a topic that, in fact, many people have also this problem of digesting and interpreting, because again, to most people at the end of the day reason by memes, right? And so of course, if we live especially in the age of memes in the 21st century in a post-traditional world, simply the notion that there is an objective truth, which is the cornerstone of tradition, is completely evaporated. Just by that standard, we unfortunately told every person they are relevant, or at least they own a certain level of quality that actually they will never achieve in their life. And people often confuse the doctrine of the two natures, the two levels. And again, it's not like in many ways tradition is currently dead. Nevertheless, the going back to this historiographical narrative, like the 19th century was incredibly concerned with not just the national identities in this sense, but also for very concrete political reasons, like not just some, again, Twitter trends or whatever, like they were literally building state, right? So there is, of course, this was happening not under the best auspices. It was mostly, again, an anti-traditional reaction in many ways that broke further apart the notion of an imperial Catholic tradition. The fact that basically any country was just to the end of itself, but not absolutized to the notion that they would actually even remember in these mythologies what it meant for a nation to take over the world. Like, say, I don't know, it did happen in Roman times. Everything was getting to the fourth estate level because that was instrumental to indoctrinating the masses and using them for specific partial purposes that, of course, also the balance of powers per se just shows. And in strictly traditionally imperial terms, just tells you that if that balance exists, if so many different nations are simply struggling with one another without a head, without an organic hierarchy, these nations are ipso facto not capable, of being as powerful as they should, and especially in obtaining, in a way or another, a proper universal leadership to be, by the way, unstoppable at that point. This is a problem we still have today. But in all this, regardless of these limits, there was also the issue of creating a narrative of national tradition, right, which obviously existed already. Many liberals or leftists would like to make you believe basically there was no nation in the past, and that there wasn't a national history, that the national identities just were created or forged in the 19th century. This is absolutely not true. Actually, many nationalists do that too, because at the end of the day, they're just socialists, but they don't know it. To say that, I don't know, this country didn't have a national identity, even though maybe they had literally centuries, at least several centuries, or even millennia at least, of de facto national history and explicit language and literature, whatever. But no, those are the enemies. So objective standards do not count anymore, and they also lost, actually, in historical perspective. This is what is oddly happening today, right? Denying national identities just to say, no, that's mine. It's not really how it works in the imperial Catholic tradition. That's not how Alexander or Rome took over the world, right? Just to make an example. In any case, too much in the cauldron that, again, 90% of people are completely, they will not get it in their lifetime. We already know that. We are working for that remaining 10% that at the end of the day is the one that leads the world anyway, so that's completely fine to exploit the others, because that's fully what they deserve in a traditional sense. So, still today, historiography thinks a lot about the last 2 centuries of our history. Today, we discuss how they view, in fact, the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages instead, and specifically of medieval European history, because also at the end, that's mostly what we analyzed. I wouldn't say that that's basically a bad thing in this sort of from a Western lens, on the contrary, because objectively European history is more important than the amount of other countries for so many reasons. Were it just for the sake of documentation, that would be enough, right, alone. I'm not adding all the moral, cultural values and so on. In any case, this, like the 14th, the 15th century, have been viewed as pivotal phase for the gestation and evolution of the structures of what was called the modern state. I use the terrible words here using biological analogies. Gestation, states are not gestated. Evolution, states do not evolve, right? Evolution is also like, at least everybody talks about evolution. What about involution? What if that is actually happening from especially a universal perspective? Structures, as if, because there are the structures that make the thing, not the pulp, the living pulp of it that makes the thing. Structuralism is historical sewage. And especially modernity. Modernity is the biggest scum of it all. It never existed. There's just the Middle Ages lasting until either the French Revolution or the end of World War I, and that basically there is contemporary history. The modern era is a complete scam by a section of academia to pretend that, to get more notice, to get more funds, whatever. The modern era never existed. There is no standard you can find to define something as a modern era. It's basically all contained in the Middle Ages already. And especially these last centuries, by the way, but not only, because that's also sort of a modernistic trick to make you believe that, the Middle Ages were just a total mess, and then suddenly from the last couple of centuries, there were these modern states that evolved. All the rest is... They don't, like, the entire concept that the biggest moment of medieval civilization was the 13th, the early 14th century, and that what came later was actually a disgregation of a much bigger system. This is completely alien to their understanding. In any case, that wars, we're not going to even discuss the concept of absolute state, which is so dumb, as the only absolute state is truly the one issued with the Code Napoleon in the age of nation-states, where in the contemporary era it has nothing to do with the modern era, right? Maria Theresa, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great would have just wished to be an absolute state. And not quite, because they actually weren't anti-traditional either, right? So, I don't know, I suggest especially to study history of law, especially medieval and modern law. We made multiple videos about that. If you don't have that kind of juridical background, basically the capacity to understand what a medieval, say by convention, a modern state, by chronological convention at least, doesn't practically exist. In any case, this viewpoint in historiography formed part of a wider effort to map Europe's political and institutional development through a sequence of distinct typologies. So this is typical of the period because, again, as I always say, there's no nationalism without socialism. You can't have, romanticism in this case without some sort of rigid categorism like positivism, progressism. This is the 19th century. Right, and both things actually, if you understand how complementary they are, how it could be reconciled to an extent to create a more corporatively traditional interpretation of history, like you realize that the 19th century wasn't even that bad as it's been often depicted. But it still was severely faulty in this ideological and very sort of dualistic premises that we still basically resent of. The influence of, let's put it in this way. On one side, so this is the problem, that there already were, first of all, some feudal states, right, that are evidently developing in the strongest monarchies, especially in the westernmost part of Europe, during the 12th and the 13th centuries. We're talking chiefly, usually people say England, France, and the Iberian monarchies. I would actually speak first of the Kingdom of Sicily, and then also looking at how the Iberian monarchies were lagging behind by the later Middle Ages in terms of actual power concentration. There's no doubt, however, that they were very important and very peculiar, especially Castile, right? But again, this is not the video we're going to look at this. Made lots of videos on medieval Spain. We'll come back on it, and so we will explain that better. So there is still, if you look at today's university manuals, I mean, you can find very strange stuff telling the truth, but the more sort of precise understanding of medieval history through era scanning, etc., normally contemplates still the idea that the feudal monarchy, provided with some kind of national and statal character, was already pretty strong by the 12th to 13th century, was at least emerging in a prepotent way in certain parts of Europe. Despite, so it's at least a valid category of interpretation, in spite really of the vast diversity and complexity of political and institutional experiences and arrangements, a diversity we know, say now as far better than in earlier times, because this is also what came later. The 19th century, you got to understand that nobody had really made real medieval history in a serious way, and they had to lay the foundations, right? So in the 20th century, historians came and said, oh no, what they were saying in the 19th century was wrong, including this entire ghostly idea, for example, of the pneuma of the universal, the soul of chivalry, the Ghibelline dream, also the real strength and conviction of connected with the national identities, for example. This was in many ways rejected by specific ideologies that were probably aiming to undermine any traditional, say, the connection with any traditional past. In the way the 19th century, to some extent, had acknowledged with all its limits, but that could have been further fostered. Rather, in the 20th century, as we know, we tend to paradoxically still stick to the skeleton provided to us in this last couple of centuries, but to publish a lot of small stuff that basically doesn't even think to challenge anymore, like the root, let's say, the system, the structure for how it was established, all right, and that actually can fluidify it, can expand it, nobody does this because it's too difficult. Properly, historians do not study anymore to be historians. They just study to be some rats, like in some archive, to write something that looks new and that they can publish in a minimal article somewhere to act as if they understood anything about the Middle Ages. This is not really a good time for history, telling the truth. The overall, say, there is another side that is this, again, the notion of the modern and the absolute state, also more strictly understood as the national state, in nationalistic terms, which increasingly monopolized the exercise of public authority with a sizable territory that was ever more directly controlled, with the populations framed in an ever more rigid bureaucratic machine and legal discipline. This is a valid interpretation of what happened, also considering that the big elephant in the room nobody discusses is, you see, they started from the national narrative, but it's not like they asked what existed before, right? There is not a huge... at least there was in the 19th century, still at the beginning of the 20th, a great emphasis, a great interest, especially in the more sort of mystical and religiously connected, at least historically religious, not random sects, also basically neglecting any kind of history for that matter in an incredibly self-referential way. But towards the universal system, towards the empire, and towards what this also meant, connected with the nation. Like, I mean, just yesterday I answered for an hour and a half a question that tended to pretend, at least to an extent, that there can't be a nation without an empire, vice versa. And as a historian, you start to be appalled at such references. But this definitely is a product of what happened in historiography. I mean, the fact that people began to study single states, it's just, I don't know, if you've ever read multiple history manuals, you've just gotten into the more in-depth bibliography about, I don't know, the last generations of the studies or of specific monarchies, etc., that basically the horizon of scholars stops mostly there. Like if they talk about to that national boundary, if they talk more about other topics, it's sort of culturalist views broadly meant, like how, I don't know, how was food in the Middle Ages, or if they don't, this is especially the case in the Anglosphere, the notion that there was an imperial mystique that the same earthly authorities abided by, in the vision of a collective redemption of the world through divine grace, aka imperium, is completely not there, does not belong to the cultural vocabulary of contemporary historians. If you talk to them, they may be sort of the most expert figures in their respective fields. They literally have never even heard of this. And or if they did, they literally do not understand that. Like they know it exists, and it's mostly framed in that kind of scary boogeyman kind of, but that this is more like an ideological. They haven't even begun to understand the metaphysics, the theology, but from a strictly documentary historical point of view, that instead is plenty of, and is also pretty obviously general. Even like you don't even have to make this a huge effort to get into it and to have it explained. Also because so much was actually written and printed and published about it, also taught in universities. So again, this tells you how self-referential and narrow-minded most scholarship is actually today. Now, between these two sort of sharply delineated interpretative frameworks, that is to say, a more fluid sense of medieval realm, say statehood to some extent, and the later nation state, emerged a chronological and logical connection that was less clearly defined and less consistently characterized. For the 14th and 15th centuries, historians largely, so the later ones, not the ones of the later Middle Ages, embraced a teleological approach, all right? At least in part, one that was relevant only to specific European states. I was making the example before, namely the major national monarchies of Western Europe, France, England, Spain, etc. This was because from the 16th to 18th centuries, and even into the 19th century, Europe featured a broad spectrum of states organized on federal, civic, or regional lines, such as the Swiss Confederation, the Italian states, the Habsburgic Empire, or the Dutch and Belgian regions, that evidently eluded that kind of especially nationalistic, statalistic, but not nationalistic, socialistic understanding of history. And again, it's not like there isn't an element or an embryo of certain ideological pieces, right, to explain this stuff, because everything does stem from some reasoning on the past. But it's evident that the traditional world was something much more coherently organic and relativistically self-referential, like a nation-state is, right? To a nation-state, what only matters is itself, right? They don't ask themselves if there is some broader point by divine mandate, whether there is a universal mission, whether even their imperial ambitions are actually, metaphysically, to be metaphysically founded, if anything, to achieve that world domination. None of this. You can find single ideologues and maybe get again into that more occult side of the story, but in practice, like you still find this in medieval history manuals. Most of the history is explained through the feudal monarchies, right? And so what resembles more like the modern state. And honestly, in my experience as a YouTuber, where I got so many questions from the outer side, not just from my students at university, the main problem, really, at least maybe because I come from a place where we tend to teach specifically what these different, this less institutionally aligned polities are literally most difficult to understand. Like in my experience, of course, most people tend to use to pretend at least, let's say, to use intellective shortcuts to pretend that they understand the world and history and how everything goes just by, first grader category, say conceptual categories, and unavoidably this does not tend to end particularly well. And this actually shows not just a great ignorance in the world, but also especially great laziness. Like, if you want to understand history, you must spit blood, right? You must be kicked in the mouth, right? It's not something that you can sit simply watching my videos or reading books, because people think that by reading books they understand things. Reading has nothing to do with understanding, right? At least they are two very different things. They can overlap, but learning, studying, understanding, researching are completely different things. And history is, in fact, should be at least a serious one if we want to use some standard. So within this teleological framework, of course, scholars that sinned in this direction search for, sometimes exaggerating or overestimating, the earliest notable indicators, especially of centralized, in this case, royal authority in the 13th and the 14th centuries. Now, of course, a state is measured by some degree of power concentration, otherwise you wouldn't identify that. So, obviously, it's important to study such indicators. But these indicators are just a very statistical way of looking at history. You must understand, if anything, why, for example, that polity began to coagulate exactly in that area, and what existed before, which is not just what, as we were saying before, modernists would like to make you believe, that the centralized state began in the modern age. No, there is just power concentration that existed since ever, even in the first civilizations, and that basically increases over time. There's nothing, especially between the contemporary and the medieval eras, that stands in between, like something distinctly categorizable as we were saying before, a modern state. It's a complete chimera. It's a complete made-up hallucination. I don't even know how to explain this. And in fact, this approach is not really too useful just per se. So these indicators included, for example, the establishment of a monopoly over taxation, the sole right to legitimate violence, and the growth of bureaucratic and diplomatic systems that wouldn't absolutize in a subtle sense again until the 19th century, literally. So this was a strong problem also in the 19th century itself, right? Because it's not like, I don't know, Germany or Italy were unified from the same background, right? Germany came from essentially a federal, feudal background. Italy came from essentially a French influence and also Italianly statal system from quite, again, different backgrounds, respectively. So this historiographical perspective to look at different, say, especially at the larger monarchies, and to just fixate fundamentally on that, because it resembled more what was being achieved in the 19th century, was complicated enough. It did not overlook the contributions of institutional entities that had been granted specific privileges by the monarchy, because evidently this monarchy existed, as it was the case before the Code of Napoleon, to respect constitutions that already existed and were the ones of the various communities that lived in what eventually became these nation states. And in fact, if you study basically this monarchic activity, it's just a constant engagement with them. We're talking the representative bodies, the urban centers, and beyond. Again, we made multiple videos about medieval law. Those are very important. It's not like every time there is some, I don't know, word like ethnic in the title, you have to click all en masse and, just neglecting what I've done. If you want to understand anything about what I'm doing, you should ideally study all what I've done here, because the answers are there. Most of what I do is not much just repeating myself, at least repeating different topics, although sort of analyzing them from different perspectives, but just also presenting all this variety of content for those who are supposed to eventually build and hopefully build some kind of personal cultural baggage on their own. Cities, we talked about them. They are sort of the most, again, incredibly, at least from my perspective, the most difficult to explain to people. Like how a city could be a power on its own, could be a state on its own, could be a territorial, a regional power on its own. And this in fact represented an interpretative dilemma. It's the same reason why still, I don't know, on disclosure in books from about the Middle Ages, especially from the Anglo-Saxon, where you still have, again, just, of course, a great centrality of England that fully fits the national monarchy in almost privileged way compared even to the others. And then all the rest that is just, maybe if there is some power here and there that looks cool for some reason, that has some attendance to certain other issues that occurred in English history, including the Reformation. So we will count on that, we will make some echo of that, but the notion that, for example, I explained countless times on this channel that literally powers like, I don't know, Milan were more powerful than, for example, the Kingdom of England itself, just at a political, military, and economical level, is something that I've personally never found in the entirety of all. I have over 14,000 books, most in English and most about military history. I literally never found any attention dedicated to this macroscopic reality. And so talking about the Middle Ages, this is pretty weird, and I will keep exposing this in other videos hopefully soon, because it really makes you think, like, the length people have gone without realizing what proper history is. Cities upheld a unique legal structure and a notion of citizenship, grounded originally in the so-called coniuratio, that is to say, a sworn communal oath, which was to some degree at least was seen by this historiography in conflict with the expansion of royal authority. This is wrong, meaning that, of course, every community competed with one another. This wasn't unique to cities, right? And so, for example, if you look at, I don't know, Frederick Barbarossa and the Lombard League, the notion is, okay, it's basically, I don't know, imperialism versus, I don't know, municipalism or whatever. It wasn't what that was about at all, right? The Lombards were proud imperial subjects. Frederick Barbarossa, in this case, at least the emperor, was absolutely equipped with all the means to deal with, to administrate, to exercise justice in these communities. They all knew each other pretty well. The reasons were very different and much more articulated for that conflict. So you see why we talk of shortcuts, because the 13th, the 14th centuries, so the later medieval centuries in particular, maintained the continuity of certain national monarchies that still fit, again, more similarly national-statal one that the 19th century could mirror itself into. This received, by the way, theoretical articulation from, for example, Italian jurists during this time for different reasons, in part, and I made videos on this, when we talk about, for example, Marsilius of Padua, but also William of Ockham, for that matter, talking about Ludwig of Bavaria, etc. They are anti-traditional, they're anti-universalistic works. They are born in a moment of major crisis of the great medieval civilization, and therefore understood as allegedly seminal for that concept of later national-statal development. Now, of course, the later Middle Ages are exactly this, the huge elephant in the room that nobody talks about, that is to say, the emergence of these nation-states, not as much of a progress in line of principle, but actually the sort of makeshift solution to the collapse of the universal system. In theory, even at that point, because this was not teleological, right? Like sort of affirmation of a political and territorial control of a actually narrower basis than it had been before. I mean, the same national monarchies in the 13th century had truly traveled on a universal scale. They had this universal vibe attached to them. Some of these national monarchies were openly pursuing an explicit universal goal, even within single regional realities. Nobody talks, for example, about the Spanish the Castilian Afro-Iberian ambitions, or how still again the Ghibelline dream or the Guelph-Angevin Commonwealth, so to say, were aiming and almost succeeding to that. There was a level of imperial notion even in Britain. Like the English had always had clear in their mind that the British Isles belonged to them, right, regardless of whoever inhabited them besides them. We can say, of course, that in the last generations there have been studies on these topics, but at large, right, the channel has remained just, let's talk about bureaucracy. Let's talk about how this kingdom established functionaries and began to tax people. Like the entire sort of political vision, military action, for example, and more, like the broader social cultural feeling, like morality, that has not been appreciated. This mostly stemmed, of course, from a structuralistic approach, like to essentially a fundamentally socio-economical interest, tendentially materialistic interest, right? Now, certain currents, in fact, of the 19th century thought extolled these principles, right? And contemporary scholarship, yes, adopted and expanded upon them as models, but severing that more idealistic and moral element of it. It is clear that the primary emphasis was placed, at least in the 19th century, on consolidating power, and later in just basically fixating on some kind of bureaucratic notion of this, or at least this socio-economical dimension of this phenomenon, still within, again, the national boundaries. And again, I can't stress enough how the normal examples that are still used in socio-economical studies are simply start from, okay, let's start fishing random data from this or that country because it seems more important, and let's skip the inherent dynamics of what was happening in the rest of Europe because never mind, I have this at hand, and that's where I just have the statistical data that are also, like, frankly, quite objectionable. What kind of statistical data do you want to extrapolate with any degree of precision, if not by creating other practically worthless historiography from the Middle Ages, right? For the way, unfortunately, documents do not really support us. I mean, there is a wide political military history. Why don't you study that? That is much more objectively telling than anything you can try to pinpoint just with a figure or another written on a piece of paper that you found somewhere in an archive. Now, drawing on the renowned ideas put forth by Max Weber in the early 20th century, scholars refer to the state of officials, pinpointing the class of functionaries as a key mechanism through which the prince's authority shaped, guided, and at times coerced territorial social forces to align with his directives. What I would like to stress here is the paradox of seeing how even idealism at some point engaged in historical materialism of some sort. It's not much just the fact that Marx and Weber's respective schools, in fact, accepted, of course, the mutual influence of matter and spirit, but how even, in fact, the idealistic, and this is the problem we still have today, you think that nationalism is right-wing. Nationalism in traditional views is leftism, all right? It's already something that collectivistically sclerotizes the identity of a nation. basically denaturating it from its most intimate spiritual ghost and pneuma and proper transcendental force. If what you can, if as a nationalist, the best thing you're looking at is unsurprisingly statalism, and so just how state officials and bureaucracy work. Like, you're basically a socialist yourself, and this all adds up, as a matter of fact, considering the fixation for this at the end of the day, sort of structuralistic approach, regardless of the teleology and or the historical determinism, even more. Naturally, the history of state officials is important, like understanding why, for example, France was already a fully fledged state by the 13th century compared to England, that did not develop, like the Capetians, a third estate level of functionaries to rule, in fact, a much wider country is actually quite important. And it is important also at a national moral level, as it does definitely correspond to the specific royal vision, political vision of in this case, of a national monarchy that sees itself as now something bigger and tendentially imperial, or in the early days still, and never quite ending, especially if we think about France in that sense, but ever, especially in a more territorially defined way, right? I will not engage in further history of philosophy considerations, but it's obvious that eventually what happened to France the century after, during the 100 Years' War, would reflect this basically exhausting, this lack of elan, right? The third estaters that take over the administration, while sort of part of the knighthood becomes poorer and others becomes more oligarchic and detached from the rest is a punchingly valid point in sort of historical interpretation in some sense. It's not like any of this doesn't matter. It's the overemphasis, the lack of perspective, the fixation on a single element that ruined everything. And this is not much the fault of a historical interpretation, but of the moral degeneration of mass society and fourth estaters in the 19th and the 20th century and beyond. So the idea of this princely authority shaping, guiding, at times coercing territorial social forces to align with his directives through these functionaries of his is fascinating, is important, should be studied. But it's not the only thing. There's not just this state and bureaucracy behind that, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't even explain how this could be formed and why it would be formed, right? Why would there be like any force capable of creating this, and why before it apparently did not exist and it actually still did exist, just in ways that did not look enough nation-state-like to be properly considered. And this is mostly, again, even just a modernistic problem, because at the end of the day, let's say by the 19th century, we arrive to the contemporary era. So whoever studies that does not even care too much about a fait accompli, right? Instead, where the moderns will have to stress the most this vision, this categoristic vision, to even justify this prejudice and the fact that allegedly there would have been an age without a state before these events were taking place in the later Middle Ages, which is absolutely insane. A similar weight, of course, was given to changes in the military domain. Military history, however, was not really very well studied by structuralists that mostly focused on institutions, on numbers, on, again, costs, right? Even the recently passed Philippe Contamine, it was a great historian. I liked his work very much. As you know, it's one of the cornerstones, like properly of contemporary historiography on the topic. And of course, as a Frenchman, he was influenced by that sort of age in which he lived that witnessed a lot of structuralism, etc., but he was himself influenced by mostly this notion of, let's look at the society behind it, or the cost, or the organization behind it, not much the actual tactics, for example, but even just the actual strategies, the actual campaigns, the political will behind that, and beliefs that were something not relatable to a post-traditional society, meaning we will read, at some point, we will make maybe a book review about La Guerre au Moyen Âge, which is his sort of most famous work, because in that sense, it's not like he doesn't make an effort, but he really showed that not to know, after all that. There is a lot also in there of late medieval bias, meaning that the other eras are really treated with in fair depth to an extent, but again, always with that same kind of cut, and with that tendency that basically heads more preferably to the later medieval times, also because you simply have just a more explicit info about that, but not necessarily a better picture of the whole. So, of course, there is so much you can do in a single book. I'm not saying that we are ungrateful for that work, but just for saying how people are unavoidably going to be influenced eventually by these methods and these philosophies of history. Naturally, from a military point of view, and surprisingly so, really, even in the aforementioned work, great emphasis was placed on the shifting from feudal to professional armies. This is a topic we recently browsed more than once. I never really created a playlist dedicated to this because it seems to me, in fact, a bit too structuralistic as a notion, but there is, in fact, an attention that would be better given to properly professional permanent militaries to show that, in fact, it did not really appear in parallel to, for example, the establishment of a specific feudal monarchy, or at least it wasn't simply unique to that. This happened in Milan, for example. How do you frame Milan, we mentioned before, or even just this was actually happening also in Florence, in other places that were not monarchies, and that for a long time, even, I mean, look, the Saint Philippe de Comines tells you from the Middle Ages that the French sovereigns began to just maintain these companies without discharging them, and etc., just like the great lords of Lombardy did, right? So this is once again a proof of the deviation that historiography carried out just because of the aforementioned ignorance, laziness, and or just the necessity of following a certain path. It can be also not just a historiographical current, but for example, just a national one. I mean, if you're a historian that does not know more than a few European languages, of course it's difficult also to research certain realities rather than other. You shouldn't, however, sclerotize into those, nor you should think that those have value just per se without considering that they were part of a whole. Otherwise, what kind of diachronic and comparative approach you could ever have in the art of war, which is unsurprisingly understudied, under-researched. It's really, it goes full circle. Another aspect is diplomacy, right? You will find modernists tell you that before this specific decade, there weren't ambassadors. Specific decades like, I don't know, the second half of the 15th century. As if, I don't know, in the 13th century, they didn't have ambassadors. No, because the modernist has to explain to you that in order for an ambassador to be an ambassador, there must be these three criteria. They had ambassadors all the time, throughout all the Middle Ages. It doesn't matter what criteria they used. They had all the same function, and they still made diplomacy, international politics. And if you think they didn't, you may have a mental illness, all right? This is just, again, sheer ignorance, because it does not even, like, if you know evenemential politics or war, you just know that, I don't know, Liutprand of Cremona was an ambassador in Ottonian times, and he did things on a very big scale. This is insane. Like, also the mere concept of, but this wasn't permanent. There wasn't a permanent frame, and so if it wasn't permanent, it did not exist. we arrived to, that's how obsessive this thing of the nation state as a permanent, statalistic, bureaucratistic thing was especially by the modernists, not even by the contemporaneous, by the modernists. Because, again, without this nonsense, the modern era the departments of modern history wouldn't even exist. And so, again, there was surely a development with a gradual introduction of new frameworks and approaches for handling interstate relations, but the latter always existed. Right? So the permanent diplomatic missions, which means that there was a guy who was permanently paid to stay in another city. Wow, what a great change. As if before, by the way, these people didn't have means to stay there, also privately, and or still non-permanently found, intermittently founded. So before they didn't exist, according to this view. So it's truly a mental illness. I mean, I'm not joking. Like an adult, a supposedly adult person who reasons like this has severe neurocognitive deficits. Like, it's not really possible to imagine otherwise. It's not a hyperbole. And so, think about diplomatics, right? You can't look at the later Middle Ages just to think that this is the moment in which interactions among political entities were formalized. These were always formalized since the dawn of history, right? That's why there is history, by the way, documents, etc. This is literally like the sanctioning of very specific relations, accomplishments, properly forms of power, right, being established through it. And even before that, they existed for that matter, right? Just we decided to stop there at mere documentation, but it's not like people did not exist and they didn't do stuff, also with an important degree of power. The transformation of judicial administration is also emphasized in this historiographical perspective because, again, everything that comes out of an archive, that from institutions that started operating in a more or less formalized way, seems like the holy grail for any researcher. Never mind not knowing literally anything of what was going on at the time at court or in battlefields, etc. But it's just, during trials, during these issues. It's not like it's unimportant, but what was happening in royal courts with royal law, it cannot be understood merely through studies of judicial administration. Right? Appellate bodies were the expression of some pre-existing communal community, let's say, organization, and it should be understood in those terms of power ratio. Unsurprisingly, significant focus was also placed on fiscal systems, a matter, of course, of critical importance. There's no doubt about this. You must study this stuff, right? You can't go without it either, right? In any case, the overly rigid manner in which this interpretative model was frequently applied in 19th and 20th century research has also since been tempered. At least it was realized that there isn't just this, right? And also, a lot of studies were actually carried out. The problem is that there was so much the habituation to the broader pictures that even the wealth of studies providing more balanced evaluations, focusing more closely on how institutions actually operated and showing greater recognition of the multiplicity of powers, started from the earlier premise that did not take into consideration the broader picture either, right? So it was obvious that not all powers were subordinate to the prince, but this still, for example, denies the traditional corporative understanding of, again, you can be a city and be under a king or an emperor and still being virtually, if not independent, at least largely autonomous and still pursuing your own, for example, statal goals, right? This stems just from knowing the story, because there are lots of works that really tell you, I don't know, pick this power and what happened to it in detail, all the various military operations, all the political issues. These works did exist, but nobody uses them anymore, right? They were written as just great works of erudition, and people are just fishing for archived documents. How would they even care about reconstructing the broader web of these political interactions? Again, there is always some level through which this information pours through, but it's never the purpose. And so a lot, for example, is being studied about how things function within a given territory. But with maybe a scholar that knows just that and literally nothing else. I once, for example, was searching for sources of polity that I was studying for the early 14th century. And I wrote a guy that was an expert at this polity for the 14th century, and he replied to me, but you should know that I'm actually an expert in the second half of the 14th century. So you're not able to tell me just like a couple of sources that I can read, just the main ones, that just for be sure of the completion of it. Of course, now I can easily find the sources myself. I was much younger at the time, but just someone who gives you that answer means, as I know today, because I can easily find those sources, like, you have, what kind of historian are you? Are you just doing it on purpose? Are you trying to prevent me from researching? How can you know what those sources are if you're any credible historian? In addition to the cities already noted, considerable shares of sovereignty were wielded in jurisdictions rooted in seigneurial origins as well. Those are actually the real mess. We've seen this very well for Germany in particular, that was in many ways that fragmented, but also in ways that very often are a bit too confused, especially like the notion is that, again, Germany was this 300 feudal states, and I don't know, Poland or Hungary were just a wall block. No, this is also a 19th century sort of nationalistic, statalistic distortion. If you were to look at how power was actually wielded, those other countries, although maintaining an apparently more unitary profile, were also subdivided like that. This is true also for any other power. This is true for France, for England even. So the way, for example, we decided to represent Germany in that way is fair to an extent, but it is still very deeply entrenched in a 19th century understanding of how you should represent power. It's just an approximation, one that does not help in a broader, in deeper sense at the same time. And this powers, like of seigneurial origin, sought and achieved accommodation, equilibrium, negotiation with princely power as well. There was no other way, especially in these cases where such local powers survived, to do differently. I talked a bit about this in the video about the Habsburgic Erbländer, for example, that refer partly to the fact that still in the Renaissance, in fact, that, say, large parts of Germany were still being run in that very medieval way, as it's really obvious. Researchers have also highlighted how much the authority of 13th and 14th century rulers depended on feudal ties, which were leveraged to establish systems of delegation and consensus. As we were saying before, there wasn't like an absolute state. Everything was based on the traditional doctrine of the castes, different communal constitutions, and a broader principle of hierarchy attributed through the principles of God-given power to the various actors that in fact were capable of wielding it. This is, for example, how the feudal notion of auxilium owed by vassals to legitimize tax collection eventually brought from, in fact, the passage from military service based on some sort of clinic seigneurial affiliation to some kind of more permanently paid professional force subsidized by the king, right? The shift from suzerainité to souveraineté, to sovereignty, to use the apt French terminology, was markedly gradual. Moreover, the established significance of representative assemblies has been reaffirmed today, and the slow pace at which a national identity coalesced around the crown, despite occasionally persuasive court propaganda, has been highlighted. As I was saying yesterday, this does not mean that nations did not exist before the sublimation of the nation-state. In fact, the nation and the state have barely to do with one another. They can overlap and almost identify, as we're also more inclined to reason, like, since we still live basically within the nation-state at the end of the day. And in the past, this existed too, but still, these operate on two different levels. If you can't see these levels, it means that you can't see tradition. You can't see the doctrine of the two natures. It basically is severed from any Indo-Europeistics, from any sort of history of religion, of European identity, of concept of clanic, dynastic lineage, tribal, national basis actually is. Right? That is the sap of the Middle Ages, of antiquity. If you don't know what that is and how all these levels overlap in different ways, it's obviously impossible for you to understand any of this, and you will try to force a national statal categorism as a method of interpretation. And this is really difficult. I mean, I sometimes have university students, especially the ones that come from other disciplines that really must make that medieval history exam for some reason. They will not understand, especially also those who study contemporary history, for example, that how did the state work in the Middle Ages. Like the entire notion that there was no standardized kind of, citizenry or centralized political, to them, paralyzes them. Right? They literally do not understand the most elementary relation of power between human beings. Because mass society, fourth estaters, fundamentally do not know what power is. And this is why we live in the age of the nation state, because it's the age of lesser people. Right? If you literally do not know how to lead and command, what for and how to fight and to kill, what's the value of life, of course you will never understand ancient or medieval history. You live in a completely, especially younger generations that are completely severed from any historical literacy, are completely cut off from reality. As a consequence, why do you think mental illness is booming? There is an ever greater alienation. People are ever weaker at so many psychophysical level because of this. Because they're done. All right? Nobody, even their family, before we were born and raised in places that gave you at least that, they were still from the nation state, of course, in our generation, but they still had the recognition that within that nation state there was still a semblance of traditional, for example, separation of estates, of sort of sense of quality, of culture. Today you have people who think that they don't have to study humanities because they're leftists. These are obviously brain-rotten people, and then they complain because they have to work 9 to 5 jobs, and they feel dissatisfied. You can do whatever in your life. If you're a lesser person, you will never be satisfied, and that's only your fault, right? Just to begin with. At another vital level linking institutions to society, scholars have stressed the idea of a political society, too. Pinpointing specific settings, those social groups, nobility, patriciates, bourgeoisie, etc., that participated in the transformation of state power, endorsed it, reaped its benefits, and were in turn influenced by it in their decision, which was discovering cold water, meaning that these were the traditional actors, like the traditional estates we were talking about, and just the fact that you need to suddenly rediscover that they existed, and even getting into what they were doing, it means that you are completely severed from the traditional doctrine of the castes. And so that's what the entire society was based on at the time, by political, military, social balance. If you literally have to reconceptualize this, because you hear of, say, concepts like the bourgeoisie or the fourth estate from 19th century political language that had already severed like the first and the second state away from that, because that's what tradition was founded on. You are basically admitting that you can't really see much more beyond this. It's as if, estate's history became a matter of socio-economical history, or just how much stuff has been written on court etiquette and not the actual meaning of the same. Everything is sort of descriptive and not analytical. All right? It's this thing existed. I will write a book on it. And the book says that it existed. It existed. Nobody explains why it existed and the very well-known traditional meaning behind that, because they don't know that it even exists. You know what's the problem? So these refinements and subtleties, of course, have sparked discussions even among the same proponents, because per se they are empty. There's some sort of weird sophistry that could, even to an extent, obscure, in fact, the concept of state itself, as we use it, which we could digress on why we call it state when the term came about, etc. And so it's just a conventional term, and that has to do with the solidity of the body politics, as a matter of fact, and so the decisive moral majority and of a group, and how it decides, and by which identity this is founded, and so on. Which obviously, as you understand, awakened, let's say, we saw before how the nation-state was created as a post-traditional, often fourth estate-based or tendentially leaning concept of history. But the nation-state was still at least seen, in a way, at least as containing certain values, for example, of that people, like in a romantic way, if you want, whatever, but still understood as that nation, that people. And it wasn't wrong, regardless of the also excessively, in fact, statalistic take on it, or even the excessively nationalistic, because it's not like the nation was fully homogeneous, was fully absolute or compact or concentrated or acting in unison. And it didn't work like that evidently enough, because of all the estates, because of all the political fragmentation, because of all the confessional struggles. It's that easy to see. But it was observed that basically the same, by dismantling, say, by overly fixating on institutions and the juridical aspect, you literally also lack the concept of who these people were, and why their state where states were actually important, and why they were further developed. I, for example, researched one polity, and I wasn't an expert on it. Thus, I read for my doctorate, I think 5 books from a scholar who wrote exclusively about that polity. And in this, I found in 5 books, like we're talking thousands of pages, I found I think the term war or military mentioned 4 or 5 times as single words. So basically this person knew apparently all the institutional juridical side of the story, archives, that kind of stuff, society. Zero, and I mean literally zero, about the military organization, the army, war, how they did this, and also consequently political and financial history. So how do you think you can know anything about this? What did you study? Structures? Administrative systems, like tax collection? What for? What do you think these people were doing it for? Zero. All right. In fact, I found out something that this person could not accept, and had not realized because she had not literally studied the eventual history of that policy. And to me, it was kind of obvious that at some point the system failed, was taken over by somebody else because they overly spent themselves with war, and they were taken over and their regime radically changed. And this person was just studying the institutions. But here the institution continues. They were done for. Politically, they were done for. All right? They lost their independence. And this person couldn't even picture that. Because it's all vague. It's all the institution in some time. And you have to study the eventual history. You have to study fact after fact of what the hell happened. Otherwise, you will not understand anything about history in any way. And so, in more recent scholarly trends, there may be even an additional factor. Without falling into excessive presentism, it seems plausible to argue that the ongoing crisis of the nation-state, squeezed between supranational pressures or ambitions, such as the gradual push for, I will not make any names here, but also there are forces of disgregation. Some thought federalism, regionalism doing that. At other times, I would say today it's immigration. I mean, the most obvious substitutive kind of factor that can radically alter the foundational, even institutions of a society, let alone properly the national identity, are sort of threatening that system. But I would say that the statal forms that we developed will not be abandoned just per se, unless there is going to be a major civilizational collapse of some sort, even just from an economical point of view, not necessarily a nuclear war or something, like just, an exhaustion. As it happened, we live in times that are oddly similar to the early 14th century that I specialize in. So I like to see parallelisms, and those weren't very happy moments, especially if you go a bit ahead in the decades. So I sometimes think that I'm in 1325 and trying to see whether things add up in the same way. And it's actually much more similar than you may think. And so there are all the various scarecrows, right? Let's say nations and states cannot be easily surpassed. All right. Other very old terminologies, the pre-Westphalian and post-Westphalian world. Oh my God! Because one scholar ever said this, then it's real, man. It's people use these terms to flatter themselves as if they understood anything of it, how politics works, if war works, if societies work. That's not how it happens. The same European Union, for example, politically or economically, is a very, very powerful mean that can be profitably used in different directions depending on who controls it and from which political background. But it's not like it's simply surpassing individual nation states. And that's why it's supposed to be a union, right? Or a federation, hopefully enough, right? Just like, the United States. Of course, like you can see there that, of course, the United States are quite unique just per se. But in fact, within the same United States, you can see how, yes, we reason by states, but are there really 50 states? Aside from American rhetoric, like we really are this, we all represented it, but or is it actually just a bigger power? Right? Because every single state never worked like a sort of fully homogeneous, absolute state where it's unattainable, right? People have this problem, in fact, of reasoning outside of the state, but also outside of the nation, because they do not see how you can, depending on the degree, approximate on what it is. It's not like you're equal to the person next to you. So mostly it's about the art of approximation and measure, and especially the realization of the things change constantly. And so that also historically things were never quite the same. And so, again, everything changes also much more quickly than it seems. Although there are certain things that, especially I would say in the spirit of a nation, regardless of how they eventually take shape in history, never quite change. You can have nations at some point are quite bold, other times are quite cowardly, But at the end of the day, they maintain certain traits that seem to perdure for a very, very long time. And in that sense, it's difficult even to historically distinguish just a narrative saying, the thing existed or not existed, depending on which kind of side of the aisle you are, for whichever reason. Most of these observations are correct. Just you must just train yourself to measure that. And that happens only politically. There is not a number, a document, or something that simply gives you the answer. We should also stop thinking that you should cite that scholar, so that's real because it's academically validated. That's not how history is. History works by authority, all right? And also by intelligence, of course. Like if you give authority to someone that doesn't quite have it, the way that happens is that you're actually pretty weak authority conferrer, so to say, so that thing will be washed away because you don't care very much. Authority manifests as the imperium. So if somebody gets things right, and that's going to resonate, and it's going to work, and people are going to recognize that beyond whatever other person says. And this, of course, doesn't mean absolutely that anyone can say whatever they want and win lottery with the right guess. It's actual experts and scholars, etc., that attain that by far in a very detached way from the masses. The point is that even though these people obviously know in absolute terms better than these people, it's not like they necessarily know things well themselves. So other people know even worse than that, or less than that. That is important to stress. So again, the very timeline, because historiography realized this, the timeline itself positioning the 13th and 14th centuries as a fragile but distinct stage in the formation of state has been reconsidered. For example, in a comprehensive study on the origins of the modern state in Europe by Genet, a long chronological scope was favored, spanning the 13th to the 18th centuries in a single sweep, extending essentially to the eve of the French Revolution and the establishment of 19th century rule of law state. I personally at least like the timeline. I would put it in mid-14th century to, in this case, depending on which country, but essentially the birth of the contemporary state. I think that is actually something more that makes more sense, right? As a medievalist, the mid-14th century crisis to me is probably the biggest fracture in the Middle Ages ever, right? You can't avoid to see how what we call this national monarch is further enucleated from the previous emperors further because of the brutality of the universal shrinking. And so the fact that these local polities locally emerge as sort of more directly viable points of references, but also almost not all of the sudden, as we just explained, but with ideologies that, of course, were much more relativistic and it could not encompass the breadth of the universal ones. Hence, also, for example, nationalism as the degeneration of the thing. Like, a person is worth just because it's born part of a nation. Why? Most people in any nation in the world suck. If anything, you should be proud to be better than other people and also than your own nation. And if your nation, of course, is better than another, that's a thing. But at the same, and it's an accomplishment. But the average is hardly the average person within every national group that in existence is pretty lame to begin with. So it's not something you should flatter too much yourself about or at all. Especially today, frankly. But even the further approach, for example, looking at the broader length, it sort of substitutes the teleological endpoint with another, tacitly ascribing, for example, to the revolution a transformative epochal role that, in truth, it did not entirely fulfill even in France, because you could start saying, okay, the Code Napoleon established the law, the state, as the sole source of law. But what did this actually mean? Did it mean that there were just, everybody was a citizen with equal rights? No, we know it too well. Like, only a few people could vote, and based on their also on their wealth, and this is something that existed also before. Without mentioning that institutions change. You have a republic, then an empire, then a monarchy, then an empire, then a republic, and then an empire once again. So it's, at least the history of France is pretty complicated. But just showing that, in fact, not even in the age of nation states, that there is a univocally crystal state that is always the same, or that it still works based on people. In fact, we created this big ghost, non-existing ghost that maybe exists actually just in, again, the spirit of these people, this political identity and cultural background of the nation and many other aspects, but that is not merely the state, right? This is a problem, really. We will talk about this also for contemporary history. It's really a big issue. For this reason, it's essential to remain mindful of this intricate web of notions and layers of cultural interpretation that burden the subject when retaining the chronological focus, for example, like in our historical videos of the 14th and 15th centuries. I think that those are, again, the best antidotes, like looking at good evidential videos that tell you what was happening step by step, how certain steps were literally taken at some point, generations. We look at, the French kings of the second half of the 15th century. There's a very specific sort of timing, tempo, and it's it all adds up to showing that important events happen all the time, and so that you shouldn't take them for granted or unseriously. Right? Things are not just the product of big changes you can't even see. They're changed. That's a convenient excuse. Usually structuralist reason like that. There is kind of historical determinism. There are bigger causes that people don't see. Up to a certain point, because at the end of the day, it's still people that do things. So people may be imperfectly failing at what they do, and so causing things unintentionally, but it's not like they're not actively doing that even in that moment. So everything is the product of everything else at the end of the day. And so you can't even simply say, oh well, large masses do not understand it, these are bigger factors that happen somewhere, and even trying to explain which one they would be. It doesn't happen. The individual has an important role always, and it's a mirage to presume that it's not important. And I would say that political and military history really show how important, regardless of not just the collectivity, but the individuality is. There is no doubt that the collectivity is, as a whole, more punching, but there is, on average, but there is one person will change everything anyway, and so even if you can't keep track of everybody, you realize that everybody is bringing to something, way or another. Certain systems seem really stable, but they actually are constantly changing, and we like to fall into the end of history illusion, and it's never like that. We're constantly seeing it. There is, as we were saying, an outdated division between the medieval and early modern eras as well that I hope is going to crumble before everything else. Medievalists and modernists hate each other. We must be sure. As medievalists, we think that we are the best historians, and it is true, by the way. And contemporaneous are so cute because they're so completely outside reality that there's no malice, just like naive children, and the modernists are the real evil people that should be dealt with accordingly. So this awareness encourages the use of more flexible and careful terminology, but you shouldn't exaggerate too much. You must understand what you're talking about. I think to use pretty conventional language, if anything, you must be understood. It's important, however, to do this back and forth in this, say, in the zooming, in the phasing of Europe's history of power systems, such as the so-called processes highlighted, any chapter, medieval manual chapter about late medieval states. That is really what you see pretty transversely. Again, I've read different manuals from different countries, and sometimes I've been quite surprised by how differently history is actually taught across the world. Nevertheless, the purpose of this video is mostly to evaluate in broad terms the effectiveness and applicability across time and space of the updated and nuanced interpretive frameworks that contemporary historiography has inherited from the 19th and 20th century tradition concerning 13th and 14th century European states. So the emphasis on regional variation, delays, and reversals in this process seems to be a shared foundation, especially in most recent research, which strives to steer clear of uniform, singular, and overly linear interpretations. Mostly because when you get really in the depths of an overall political, military, and social overview, that still happen. They may be simplistic, they may be just choosing a cat or another, but of course there are. It's impossible to unsee how peculiar every place really is, right? We see it from Schwerpunkt itself. Like, we look at medieval Europe in pretty thorough detail, and things are so easily characterizable for anyone who knows them in fair depth. It's not like common traits aren't important, common features, characteristics, they are. But, of course, they're not just the only thing. This perspective thus offers a more detailed and sort of multifaceted basis for assessing the development of, for example, the Italian states. Right? We looked at them, and we are actually increasing also for the later medieval period. Also for tackling the following question: what way can we speak of, for example, a shared process of institutional development, of centralization, uniformity, for example, for the monarchies of Western Europe, like the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England, the Kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which have long been central to historiographical analysis? Do the models crafted for these kingdoms, where sources use regnum or corona, not status, so state, which signifies condition or mode of being, and so it's pretty generic and certainly, in fact, very modern, right? It was a term thrown around by the French, by Machiavelli, it's that moment in political theory. Also hold for analyzing, by the way, the political territorial formation of Central Eastern, probably in Eastern Europe, which have been largely neglected, for example, even in recent comparative studies, such as the one led by Genet, we mentioned before. Lastly, revisiting the issues outlined above, is it valid to pinpoint distinguishing features or guiding principles that define the late medieval state as an entity separate from both the feudal state of the 12th and 13th centuries, and in particular the so-called modern state, to avoid theologism, that is, the overemphasis of certain aspects, those lending themselves to interpretations of monarchical centralization based on known outcomes? This is really serious. Also because I would add that, let's say, we are looking at states that eventually more or less made it from the Middle Ages to pretty much what we can see in contemporary Europe, Not always, of course, there are, especially for the smaller one that are, especially towards the east, things change dramatically for many reasons. But indeed, you see, also, this was a factor. Like, it's easy to talk about France and England pretty early on, right? The same for Spain, Portugal, even though, again, the former originated from a pretty composite system that came into being, in fact, very gradually in the High Middle Ages. You can even argue that, I don't know, what we see in Scandinavia, in Germany, in Italy is conducive to basically what we see in contemporary times without too many issues. Also because it's not much a matter of state. At least the Scandinavian kingdoms were outlined pretty early on, even before there was an actual state. Or vice versa, because at that point, what are we really talking about? But even Germany and Italy had their own national cultures without any doubt by this point, also much more pronounced in certain cases than the one of this other bigger kingdoms that at some point, as we were discussing yesterday, had to include literally other nations. Think about the Occitanians in France, and that, however, did not really have a unitary state until the 19th century, which also did cause in issues and interpretative issues, because the question is, how does, for example, the statal continuity found the worth, the value, the spirit of a country, of a nation, of a state? Think about the Sonderweg in Germany. Think about how differently interpreted, let's say, the same thing can be. There are people who just use this uniqueness, this unique path to actually highlight different aspects of this. There are very famous historians who think that, I don't know, one country, one people, one nation is sort of characteristically in one way rather than another, sometimes maybe making big mistakes, even though being sort of famous and important historian. And all this adds, let's say, to the complexity of it all, to the difficulty in realizing how relevant and, let's say, formative such topics are still today. What I think amazes me about history is not much just the fact that I do believe that national traits are very much maintained over the millennia even. But how, in this sense, in spite of all the changes that occur, how stable actually this tendency towards statalization is, right? And how sort of organically reasonable and responding to common sense it is, right? People have problems with the state, depending on what kind of community mostly you tend to belong to, because this is actually this is a very American issue, right? The idea that federal government, for example, is basically senseless and or should just deal with very specific things like the military, etc. But aside from the specifics of United States history, but if you were to look at how civilization developed, that this is unequivocally stemming from the desperate need to create more stable systems through statalization, right? And it's not like non-statal realities ended well at any point in history. So this is beyond identity per se, that there is a specific function to fulfill, and also an emergency, like something that skips any kind of whining or consideration why the state exists or not. And of course, a people that wonders why a state is there rather than knowing how to use it or even to fix it, to make it more powerful is definitely not a people in good conditions. It's an evolving, degenerating people that basically is simply declaring that they do not know how to use power anymore because they're too weak and inward and isolationistic and paranoid, and so that's all what identifies probably a collapse of the quality of a people. At some point can also, like if it doesn't have much of an internal glue, doesn't necessarily stand together. I'm not specifically referring to the United States here, because I think that, you know, the ways you found nations can in fact have very difficult premises and very different outcomes. But it's obvious that at some point a group cannot just work with wishful thinking. There must be a vision, a direction, right? Something that brings you somewhere from A to B in ways that it's not merely, like a fashion. What kind of person in charge do I want now? As a weird popularity context. You, as a nation, as a country, as a people, wherever you want, as a state, wherever you want to, whichever aspect of this identity you want to stress, you should have a propositive, proactive, projectional capacity and acting on it, right? Literally creating things, dominating, controlling it. So if you bail out of that, the survival of the system, frankly, especially the least ethnically homogeneous it is, it's not going to hold. It's going to turn in things that you don't even want to see, probably, to some point. So it's all very complicated. It doesn't work that easily at all. Nevertheless, videos like this are fairly useful, I would say, because of all the questions that I, again, as I was saying at the beginning, receive about them, people seem confused about the foundations of historical reality to a level of mirroring this level of complete political involvement and civic illiteracy, and probably like the lack of notion how to wield power to begin with. Right? Just look at foretestators constantly self-sabotaging to achieve what exactly? You think that if the system collapses, other people are not going to see that you're lesser people anyway? That's the problem. It's not much about the problem of these people acting. The problem is other people getting weak, having the system collapse like a souffle, right? That's the thing. It's not, you can't mess everything up by literally not doing anything, because guess what? By tradition, everything has to be pure energy, and so you should tend towards pure action. And aside from the VV that we looked in different history of religion videos, there isn't really, especially in this moment in the history of mankind, a way to act without acting, right? VV, of course, talks about God. It's just like the unmoved mover of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. Humans are different, and they have to move the hell up if they want to do anything. Fortunately, also those moves sometimes are so weak and disorganized they go nowhere, so you can still watch them from a distance, impaling themselves. But still, you should be powerful enough to stand even such attempts. So, difficult video, I must say. It's not one that I like too much, even though it may be interesting in a way to listen to it. I don't know, because I never re-listen to my own videos. In any case, it illustrates some aspects of, say, historiographical interpretation of at least late medieval states, as we have already outlined them. It's useful to, again, follow this narrative as well. I wouldn't throw the concept, that manual about late medieval states under the bus because of course, of all the complicacies of the picture. But it's also important to bear in mind that we are witnessing such a thing, and that it's not all just a matter of, okay, we have it all already sorted out, and we know how it is, how it ends, etc. No, there are many different ways to reach this and to evaluate it. So this is very important, and it's not easy. It's very complicated, as a matter of fact, and it would be better understood just through much more in-depth videos. That is hopefully what we're going to achieve soon. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.